So for this next session, I'm delighted to introduce Marion Pallister, who's going to speak to us about the role of the media. So Marion, as Linda was saying, we're slightly off programme, but Marion will speak for about 30 minutes and then we will have a short time, about 15 minutes for question and answer. Marion worked for most of her journalistic career with the Herald Group, and in that time she covered a number of conflicts. She was in Romania after the fall of Ceausescu, the Bosnian War, the conflict in Kosovo. And that experience of conflict has led to her current involvement in peace issues today, and indeed to her then, a few years ago, becoming chair of Pax Christi Scotland. I'm sure, like me, you will find much of the reporting in our mainstream media what could at best be called unsatisfactory. More often than not, pushing the Israeli government, the Israeli military propaganda, and boy, don't they have propaganda. But should we give it up as a bad job? Or should we challenge? Should we respond to it? And if so, how? And why? And so, Marion, and this session, of course, is titled, "Can the media be mobilised against Israeli apartheid and for Palestinian rights?"
Thank you. I'm going to use notes because A, I'm 103 and I'll forget something, but B, I've got quite a bit of research and some figures and so on, and I don't want to get any of those wrong, because that's what we're talking about, isn't it? Is not getting things the way that they should be. Forgive me, but I'm going to indulge first of all in a trip down memory lane before I address the situation in the Middle East today. And I'm doing this in the hope that it will put reporting on the occupation into some kind of context and explain the difficulties and the constraints that colour what you read and what you view. My first experience of reporting on conflict was in the East. A photographer and I were sent to Thailand to send back reportage on the refugee camps on the Thai border with what was briefly known at that stage as the Democratic Kampuchean under the Khmer Rouge. It had become the People's Republic of Kampuchea when we were there in the early part of 1980 under the rule of a Vietnamese-sponsored government, and it wouldn't become Cambodia until 1989 under a UN transitional authority, and it later became a restored monarchy. So there are complicated issues around the world. Nothing is easy, nothing is straightforward. We were to visit the refugee camps into which both factions in the conflict were pouring daily. There'd been terrible torture and violence by the Khmer Rouge. Those who wore glasses, for example, were killed because they were doomed to be intellectuals by dictator Pol Pot. What's relevant in this context is that we travelled under the auspices of the International Red Cross and a Thai airline. Our first duty was to do an interview with a Scottish Red Cross nurse, our second to do a tourist piece that would satisfy Thai Airways. If these two criteria were met, then any other stories that we got would be a bonus for our newspaper. The International Red Cross had not told our Scottish nurse that she was to meet with us in the camps. She'd just finished 3 months in those camps. They did 3-month stints and had gone off to Burma, Myanmar today, on leave, and she'd no intentions of returning to the hell of the camps. We only found this out when we travelled 400 miles to the border in the company of several Australian Red Cross nurses about to start their 3-month tour of duty. They were quite colourful, I can tell you. So we had to return to Bangkok, entertain our Scottish nurse to dinner, and persuade her to return to the camps with us so that we could take photographs of her in situ. And God love her, she did. And we were able then not only to fulfil that obligation, but to garner a clutch of other very moving stories, particularly involving the unaccompanied children crossing the border in the thousands. The Thai government didn't want those camps on their territory. The Thai army was far from sympathetic, and it was overseeing the camps. And so we had to obtain travel passes from the Army HQ in Bangkok, and that was only achieved with a heart-stopping bribe. I had never bribed anyone before, and I have never bribed anyone since, and I can tell you it was a very difficult situation. But we were going nowhere if we didn't put some money inside a passport. And we didn't understand those passes anyway because they were written in Thai script. We could have been expelled from the camps and the country at any point. That we weren't was nothing short of a miracle. And we were even able to do that tourist story on our return again to Bangkok before leaving on the airline that had subsidised our travel. In the decades that followed, I reported from a number of conflicts and natural disasters. As John was saying, the downfall of the Ceausescu dictatorship in Romania, conflicts that unfolded after the dismantling of Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, then Kosovo, terrible flooding in Mozambique, the AIDS crisis in Zambia, Kenya and elsewhere in southern Africa, the post-apartheid situation in South Africa that we were hearing about earlier. I had colleagues who covered the Falklands War and the conflict in Iraq. The editors of the newspaper group that I worked for over the years had great news ambitions. That's why they were sending us off to these places. The owners of the company, which changed, they changed over the years, I've got to say. The early days were much more positive, becoming less so as the decades went by. But the owners of the company offered budgets that favoured shareholders over news. Now, we keep that in mind, and that's why that first sortie of mine into the world of conflict was financed basically by the International Red Cross and an airline. And it's why subsequent assignments were carried out on shoestring budgets and sometimes funded by charities. The guys who went to the Falklands, Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere were, as the official phrase has it, embedded with the UK Army, travelling with servicemen, eating and sleeping with them, and observing at very close hand their experiences in actual warfare. With my hand on my heart, I can say that the stories I filed were the truth and nothing but the truth, but only as I could access that truth with the assistance of whoever got me there in the first place. Those who were embedded with the army had to weigh up their personal safety against the bias their stories would clearly carry. I have to say that having followed a small Glasgow organisation delivering aid in Bosnia, I think that time it was actually funded by our newspaper, we were given very good advice by an army boss that saved a photographer and I from walking into a hellhole. But did that advice also prevent us from reporting from the front line in an honest and unbiased way? Today there is much more protection for journalists in these kind of situations. We didn't have so much as a flak jacket in the early days, and certainly no war zone training. I do remember getting into a vehicle that was emblazoned with UN on the side of it, and a friend of mine from Glasgow was the guy who was driving it, and he said, I can give you a lift across the minefields, he said. And then when I was installed in this vehicle, said, I should have said to you that they're attacking UN vehicles now. That was kind of the way that things were. The refinements were introduced by the BBC and other news outlets, followed suit with the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, and people are fairly well protected now. There are also international laws governing the protection of journalists in conflict situations. War correspondents, according to the International Red Cross, fall into the ill-defined category of persons who accompany the armed forces without actually being members thereof. So since they're not part of the armed forces, they enjoy civilian status, and the protection derived from that status. Moreover, since they are, in a manner of speaking, associated with the war effort, they're entitled to prisoner of war status when they fall into the hands of the enemy, provided they've been duly authorised to accompany the armed forces. The UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross were behind those changes and introductions of legislation, but of course no amount of training, no endless supply of flak jackets and hard hats can keep journalists safe. Back in 2003, the International Red Cross reported that the number of journalists killed in the war in the world was 42, the highest since 1995. They added that the general trend is towards the deterioration of the working conditions of journalists in periods of armed conflict. According to the International Federation of Journalists, 129 journalists and media workers were killed in 2023, one of the deadliest years since they began tracking the number of journalists' deaths in 1990. And most of those deaths were in Gaza. The Committee to Protect Journalists now say, as of September the 26th, 2024, preliminary investigations showed that at least 116 journalists and media workers were among more than 42,000 killed since the war in Gaza began in October last year, making it the deadliest period for journalists since the figures began being gathered. And they offered this quote, "Covering a war is becoming more and more dangerous for journalists. Added to the traditional dangers of war are the unpredictable hazards of bomb attacks, the use of more sophisticated weapons against which even the training and protection of journalists is ineffective, and belligerents who care more about winning the war of images than respecting the safety of media staff. So many factors that increase the risks of war reporting." Now, I know that there are many journalists dedicated to bringing stories from front lines. I reported on the human element rather than the technicalities and strategies. I interviewed victims of rape as a weapon of war, the orphaned children, the elderly whose homes were lost and whose families were scattered. I believe that this exposure to conflict, as the introduction said, has led me to the peace and justice work that I'm now involved in. It gave me an insight, however, into how conflict journalism works. Now, I wasn't going to suggest that Jeremy Bowen had his airfare paid to Jerusalem by El Al Airlines. I think your BBC licence money does that. However, I read the other day that Jeremy Bowen, in the first few weeks after October 7, he was embedded with the Israeli army. So, I've admired his work over the decades. I think that he genuinely would want to present a balanced and unbiased point of view. But if he was embedded with the Israeli army, he was going where they were going, and he was seeing what they wanted him to see. Now, since that time, that hasn't been the case. But of course, all the journalists were chucked out of Palestine. Foreign journalists were thrown out of Palestine. So he and all of the journalists that you see are reporting either from Israeli territory or from Jordan or wherever. There are these restrictions, there are insurmountable difficulties, lots of factors that we don't actually think about that prevent us from being told a straight story by any news outlet. And of course, many therefore believe that the BBC, as well as so many other outlets, has a pro-Israel bias. And I'm not going to argue on that point because I have often felt that myself. But I know that their reporting is hugely restricted, as is every other news outlet's staff, by the fact that Israel just simply won't allow them into Palestine, especially into Gaza. And unless you're there, even with the technology that we're blessed and cursed with today, you can't present a true account of the situation. Those who are feeding you video clips and reports from within the territory can't answer the questions you might have asked. They might ask the first question that you asked them to say, but then you would have followed up with something else. And that flow of what a journalist is there for and how they're trained to operate doesn't work. You can't turn the camera in the direction you would have preferred it to point in. Now, I post every day on social media for Pax Christi Scotland. I was so wary of all the UK and US reporting that I turned for honest information about Gaza to Al Jazeera, and I heard Al Jazeera being mentioned earlier. And some in this country might have thought that I was playing with fire. Remember, these are the guys who were bombed by US forces in Kabul in 1999. But I have colleagues and friends who have worked in recent years for Al Jazeera in Palestine. And I know, first of all, the constraints they've been working under, and secondly, their commitment to give the untarnished view of the Palestinian situation. However, they too have been thrown out. They were in the West Bank and their offices were raided by Israeli forces and who issued a 45-day closure order. So that you know, that's a source that we are unable to tap into in the meantime. The Palestinian Journalists Syndicate condemned the Israeli move, saying this arbitrary military decision is considered a new violation against journalistic and media works, which has been exposing the occupation's crimes against the Palestinian people. The move has been a clear violation of international law. So if we want to know what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank, we need to get our information from organisations that we trust. But few organisations don't have their own agenda. I don't think it'll surprise anyone if I say that the Daily Mail is not on the side of the Palestinians. If we're discerning consumers of news, we'll know which side any publication is on. And that is a starting point in terms of accessing what we perceive as honest reporting. On a lighter note, there's a post being shared widely on social media right now that purports to be a notice on a newsstand, and it reads, "Polite notice. Customers are reminded that these newspapers are merely the opinions of a small group of billionaires desperate to influence public opinion and are not 100% factually reflecting reality. Please cross-reference everything you read. Thank you." Never was a truer word spoken. And I've got some figures. 3/4 of newspaper, like old-fashioned print newspaper, but which also appears online these days, 3/4 of that in the UK is controlled by 4 families. There's Viscount Rothermere, who owns the Mail and Metro, and of course Rothermere goes back to the 1930s when they were doing Nazi propaganda, so no surprise there. Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Sun and the Times, Sunday Times, various other things, and of course media outlets in the States like Fox News, that chum of Mr. Trump. Evgeny Lebedev, whose name I can't pronounce properly, and I hope he forgives me. He owns the London Evening Standard and the Independent, which is clearly not independent. And Frederick Barclay, who is the remaining Barclay twin. The brother died earlier this year, I think it was, and he owns the Telegraph, and I think is in the process of selling the Telegraph. Millions follow these online. And I would suggest, and probably get sued for it, that the views that are expressed are not what the journalist took back to the desk, not necessarily what the editor wants in his newspaper, but what those who are pulling the strings are giving us. On October 7 this year, The Guardian reminded us that the media in the UK, and especially the US, has given little attention to Palestinian journalists and reported, according to a study by George Washington University's William Humans, America's 4 flagship Sunday talk shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, This Week, and Fox News, collectively interviewed 140 outside guests on camera between October the 8th, 2023 and the 14th of January 2024. 140 guests interviewed. 1 was Palestinian. Who did the Sunday shows interview instead? For the most part, Washington insiders, and in those early months of the conflict, this whatever we're calling it, that's what they're calling it, more than 80% of the Sunday show guests were current and former US government officials. Few knew much about Gaza, and few questioned Israel's actions. So it's time-consuming to look at a wide range of media outlets to check out who's saying what and if it can be trusted. I go to the sources that many of those outlets use before they put their own spin on stories. The news agencies, Reuters and Associated Press, who report basic facts as they can access them. And remember, they're under difficult restraints as well. But then the mainstream media will then regurgitate those basic facts and use their headlines to spin the story and their editorial columns to comment on the situation. The same story may be presented startlingly differently in The Guardian and The Sun, The Herald, The Daily Record, and too many consumers actually don't get past the eye-catching headlines. And of course, that's where that vocabulary that we heard about earlier, vocabulary is so important. The words that we use. We saw it with refugees from the Tory party. We've seen how that kind of language can make such a difference. Pax Christi Scotland, a peace organisation, we talk about using non-violent language as well as non-violent action, and I think that we have to all remember that when we're trying to deal with this particular situation. Reuters have reported on how audiences perceive the media. Low trust, bias, bullshit and lies was the sad perspective. Yeah, I can hear you saying that's your perspective too. And that things have got worse since the start of this current situation in the Middle East. That Reuters report found a significant proportion of the public felt that powerful people are using the media to push their own political or economic interests rather than represent ordinary readers or viewers. Just what we said a few minutes ago, it's the ones who are pulling the strings. Some comfort in the fact that a significant proportion of those members of the public who responded to the Reuters questions felt that journalists did a good job in checking sources, verifying facts, and providing evidence to back up claims. Please have some sympathy with journalists who must now provide so much. So, in my day, I had to provide a story. Now, I might have had to have provided 2,000 words, but that was the end of it. And I might have been in Kosovo and trying to phone that over on an old-fashioned telephone. Eventually, I think we were just onto computers in the Kosovo situation. But you had to get that over to your office. It might have been a long piece that you had to do, and you had all of the interviews and so on beforehand. But now they've got to produce a written piece, a piece to camera, a piece for a website, a piece for this and a piece for that. They have got a huge amount of stuff. And you like Sir Jeremy Bowen and Lise Doucette and so on the BBC. They're popping up all over the place. I mean, I left home this morning just after 6, and I was listening to the Radio 4 morning programme, and these guys were popping up there. I've no doubt they were on the telly as well. I've no doubt that they were already filing pieces for X, as we call it now, and Facebook and so on, and that they would have been required to do something for the BBC's websites. So there's a heck of a lot that has to be done. And if you can't get hold of your besieged contact in Gaza, then you're in trouble. So I'm not making excuses, I'm just explaining what the facts are. And add to that the overriding fact that these shady, unseen bosses that are pulling the strings are not necessarily wanting to hear the facts as they actually are. There's been a more recent Reuters report on trust. The UK is not very keen on trust at the moment, and I'm not surprised. So I'd like to turn a little bit to social media and YouTube before we think about how we can hold the media to account and how we can use our voices to seek honest reporting from around the world, not just from the Middle East. It's been thought that there is more likely to be inaccurate information, extreme agendas and strong opinions from what we're now calling citizen journalists, defined as those who are untrained. However, in recent times, we've had to rely on citizen journalism from all over the world because trained and accredited journalists simply haven't been able to access the crises that we all want to know about. Technology and social media have made citizen journalism more prevalent, and social media algorithms send so many instances to your way once you've clicked and followed. We share the guilt, of course, when we share citizen journalism or any journalism without trying to verify in any way what we've read. Indeed, have we actually read it? I think that it's really, it can be very irritating, but you know now you get that thing when you try to share something on Facebook or on X and there's a little thing pops up and says, don't you want to read this before you share it? Now, you should be reading it before you share it. You know, there are bits down the line on that report or in that video that might not be what you want to share. The headlines, yes, but the bit further down, are you sure? So that irritating little message is actually a godsend. Take notice of it. So, whether it's natural disasters or civil unrest in Haiti, civil war in Syria, the Black Lives Matter movement, or the current situation in Gaza and Lebanon, without citizen journalism, there would be a news blackout. I know that with Pax Christi Scotland, I join a number of regular and frequent meetings with Pax Christi International, speaking to people in Gaza. Really brave guys who are you know, sitting in the middle of all of this, and they will spend an hour of their time online with us, filling us in what's going on. And that is absolutely brilliant. And I've asked a couple of them to write for our Pax Christi Scotland newsletter, and they've done that. I mean, God love them. You know, they're in the middle of all of this, and they will do that because they want us to know the situation that they are going through. And as we already know, because everybody in this room knows every last thing about this, we're talking about hell. So our focus today is on whether the media can be mobilized against Israeli apartheid and for Palestinian rights. I hope that that broad picture of the difficulties helps you understand what some of the problems are, but mobilizing the media is maybe the wrong question. It's maybe about mobilizing us. And we were hearing about this, you know, earlier, about a movement that makes a difference. And we've got to vote with our purchasing power or our social media likes and our likes and shares of podcasts that reflect what we want everybody to know. The pro-Israel media won't, I fear, be persuaded to change its spots, but I do think it's possible to influence less biased media, including the BBC, if you complain loudly and frequently about what you perceive to be apparent prejudice. Journalists like Owen Jones, who's a Guardian columnist but also has his own independent podcast channel, he's been holding politicians of all parties to account, and he's done some hard-hitting interviews on the Middle East situation. Like that and share, but also tell the BBC and all the other news outlets that those are the voices that we want to hear. We don't want, like Fox News, to hear all of the Washington insiders. We don't want all of the queue of Westminster heads, talking heads, telling us what we should be thinking. We want the real voices, the Palestinian voices. We want those interviews. And if we tell them, it might happen. We've got to move the media away from that narrow scope of their interviews. We don't want the insiders, but we've got to be active. As with any campaign, we get nowhere if we don't use our voices. We tell the media platforms that we want to hear the Palestine voices, the pro-Palestine voices. We want to hear about human rights, not how many rockets have been fired, but what human rights have been violated by those rockets that have been fired. The stuff that we need to pass on, and I think that we've got to think about our role as well. Ask for a transparent media. Ask that it looks into its heart and also seeks the common good. Technology allows us to be that vocal, and you know, every media outlet's got a website, it's got a Facebook page, it's got something on X. That's where you can go and be vocal and say all of the things that we were hearing about this morning, and that means that we can change the agenda of the media by changing. I'm going to tell you a little secret, right? Journalists learn I lectured in journalism after I left doing that stuff. And I lectured at Napier University in journalism. And the first thing you tell them is that in your story, you're going to have 5 W's. You're going to start, your introductory paragraph is going to have those 5 W's in them. And that's the who, what, why, where, and when. And it's the who that we are concerned with. And we've got to demand to hear the voices of those who speak against Israel's apartheid agenda, those who speak on behalf of Palestinian human rights. Yes, it can work. You might be looking a bit dubious on this one, but I'm going to finish up in a couple of minutes, if that's okay. Absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but 2 positive stories of how the public changed things. One was that, there was a program about AI the other day, and they were talking about photoshopping, you know, when you alter photographs to make them look either perfect or land people in deep trouble. When photoshopping was first used at the turn of the century, fashion media such as Vogue and Showbiz magazines and so on photoshopped everything that moved. And so they were presenting on their covers perfection, models and actresses and actors looking far from the truth, but perfect because of the photoshopping. Did the public like it? No, they didn't. And so they complained and complained and complained, and said we want reality, not airbrushed nonsense. And photoshopping in that sense stopped in those kind of magazines. Perhaps even more noteworthy, public opinion brought to an end the sexist page 3 photographs in The Sun and other newspapers in, I'm assuming that you remember what the page 3 photographs were. In 2012, activist Lucy-Anne Holmes launched the No More Page 3 campaign with the goal of persuading newspaper editors and owners to end that voluntarily. It got support from 140 MPs, it got 240,000 signatures on a petition. It wasn't done overnight, but 3 years later, The Sun no longer published degrading page-through pictures. By 2017, its website stopped publishing them, and the Daily Star managed to pull its finger out by 2019. Nothing to do with what we're talking about, but the public can change things. The public can influence what the media produces. We can make changes, but we have to use our voices, our emails, our petitions, our social media. Thank you for listening. I've probably gone on far too long. I apologise, but do it. Go for it. It can work.
Thank you, Marion.
It just means I can answer fewer questions.
Yes, I know. Yeah, there you see, journalists for you. Let's just sort of try to catch up a little bit on our timetable and just have a quick 5 minutes for questions. But just when I was listening to Marion, one of the things that came to mind, now and you've probably seen it, there was a CNN article about these poor, and don't get me wrong, I do think soldiers are victims as well, but these poor Israeli soldiers who were traumatised by what they saw rather than what they did in Gaza. But then there's also been some really good reporting from CNN about the situation in Gaza as well. The Guardian, I think, is similar. The Observer a few weeks ago had that article by Howard Jacobson, which was basically saying it was blood libel if you talk about Palestinian children being killed, and then on the other hand they can sometimes produce good things. So I suppose it's a bit looking at that as well, and not just complaining is what I'm trying to make, but to say thank you when it's something good. So just David.
I have a few points that relate to things that have been said. The American journalist Matt Taibbi, according to him, his father was a journalist, and according to Matt, in the generation that his father was part of, journalists came from mostly from working class backgrounds. What has changed up to the present day is that the mainstream media recruits their journalism mainly from the elite universities in the United States. So the journalists are coming from the same class in the United States as the political class. So that, in terms of journalism, maybe partly explains some of the points that you made about, for example, how the mainstream media just seems to accept the Israeli narrative and report it without questioning it, because they've gone to the same schools, the same elite universities as the politicians. Alternative sources of alternative journalism sources that I think are good include the as alternatives to the mainstream media. Probably most of you know at least some of these: Electronic Intifada, Middle East Eye, Double Down News, and The Grey Zone. Now, two of the reporters for The Grey Zone have, in the last month, been targeted. One in the UK, one in Israel. In the UK, Asa Winstanley, his house was raided. He didn't actually get arrested, he didn't get charged with anything, but his devices were taken away. And probably most of you know that story, so I don't need to add any more to it. Well, the only thing I would say is Owen Jones has been doing quite good recently, but you know, Asa Winstanley has a much longer consistent record than Owen Jones in terms of reporting with regard to Palestine. The other, another one, Richard Medhurst, was arrested when he arrived back in the UK and held and questioned for 23 hours under terrorism legislation. And in Israel, just in the last 3 weeks, another reporter of the Grey Zone, Jeremy Lofredo, was taken into custody, held in custody for almost two weeks, had 3 courts appearances with different judges for reporting that could give information that could help the enemy, was the pretext that was given. In the first court appearance, an Israeli journalist, I think with Wine, actually spoke up and said, I reported exactly the same thing, which was a little video at a site where an Iranian missile had landed. And he had reported the same thing and included Lofredo's video embedded in his report. So eventually, but I mean, Lofredo was held 3 days with almost no water, in solitary confinement, almost no water or food. And eventually he was released and allowed to return within the last week to the United States.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's true that journalism is under attack, including from our so-called Labour government. Anybody got any questions, Kate?
Why do you think Scottish journalists haven't made more of the connection between the clearances, which still resonates so strongly in Scotland, not in England, and the dispossession?
And you know, that was going through my mind this morning, this afternoon when we were looking at the film there.
Yeah.
And it's also stuff like the language being taken from you, your culture being taken from you. Yeah, that's something that you might suggest to our dear friends at the Herald, for example. Somebody's got to remind them, and it's good. Do it nicely, but do it because it's something that will make people think and relate to. And I think we've all got to relate to this. It's not. I'm going to say something that is really, really crass, and I should be shot for it, but I'm always questioning why we could open our arms, God love them, to the Ukrainians, but we're not opening our arms to the Palestinians. And I think that people could probably relate to the Ukrainians because they look like us.
Racism.
And we've got to think about how we get the media to relate us to the people that we're talking about. And that is an excellent point, and I think if you can do that and tell the media outlets that you want to get to grips with that, then that would be doing us all a favour. Okay. And I'll do it as well.
Yeah, but it is this idea, we tend to think that it's about complaining, and that can be a part of it, but it can also be saying, thank you, that was a really great article, or that was a really great programme, or indeed it can be saying, how about doing, and I've got an idea of somebody who was in the Suffragetta and who also lives on Skye and who could probably, just one more question, is there anyone, or are we all girded up to take on the media?
Do you not think that the mainstream media is on its way out? Young people don't go to mainstream media, they go straight to social media, and they are the future, and so I feel the mainstream media have shot themselves in the foot, because young people, especially in Palestine, they look to what they see on social media, and if they do catch the BBC they know that it doesn't bear.
That's right.
They can't compare the two, and they're seeing direct from Palestine.
That's why I brought in about social media, because that's where we've got to go. You know, we need to operate through what is happening now, not, you know, I mean, most of the newspapers, well, they've got online following, but they certainly don't have print following. But yes, young people are not going to look even at their online material. So yeah, we've got to go where they are, and where everybody is, and that's social media, and we've got to do our own thing with that.
Thank you. I think overall this has been a very positive message to move on from. So I'll hand back to you, Linda, and thank you very much, Mary.
Session is entitled Focusing on the Big Picture, How Can Popular Mobilization Be Made into an Effective Instrument for Changing Government Policy? We talk about finding the pressure points in terms of changing government policy. During the last year, there's been so much activity happening in response to October the 7th. Now, is all of the activity strategic activity or not? Maybe that's a question that needs to be asked. What are we doing that is causing a change? So we've got two women who are going to speak in the next session, and we're starting with Livnat Kanapi de Cleve, who's a political anthropologist. In your information box, you've got her full biography, so I'm not going to go through it all right now. But she's going to come as a critical Israeli Jew as well as this political activist. So Livnat, can I turn over to you to speak? And thank you.
Thank you, Linda. So I stand
Yes,
to be able
please.
to see everyone. First of all, I want to mention that we are not only women, but Jewish. I'm Israeli, so it's also, if we talk about mobilization, popular mobilization, we would talk about mobilization as Jews, I suppose, but at least me, that's what I will talk about. So just to be clear that it's a different kind of mobilization if we think about it. And before asking how can we change government policy, I think that we should ask previous questions, which are, should we aim at changing government policy, and also can we change it? So the question of should comes from the fact that at least the groups that I work with and the kind of popular mobilization we are talking about, which is anti-Zionist, don't aim at changing the government policy, but they aim at a much more radical, profound change. So the government as it is, at least in Israel, doesn't in any way, even the Palestinian-led parties do not in any way represent the kind of change that we would like to see. And therefore the question is, should we aim at trying to in some way have some influence on government policy? And the short answer that I would like to give is yes, because we have to think about the way I see things, and maybe we are different in that way also, though, is that we have to think about different aims with different time, how should I put it, with different terms, like short-term objectives and long-term objectives, trying to change things superficially or trying to change things much more radically, much more profoundly. And the superficial short-term change is needed for people to survive the horrors that this government is producing and the Zionism has produced for many years before that. So I think that we have to direct our actions into different audiences with different aims, all the while always remembering what our long-term objective is and what is the long-term vision that we have in mind, and I will come back to it later as well. But because one of the reasons that I think like that is not only because I think that people have to survive through this process, and in that case, Israeli Palestinians, so what Israel is calling the Arab Israelis, they are in between many pressures. They are being scrutinized by Israel and by Israeli Jews, and they are also being criticized by Palestinian diaspora and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza as being cream Palestinians, or I don't know how this term is being translated. So their position is very difficult, and I think it should be taken under account, and it should be they should be able to hold on to their place in Israel while waiting for a much larger solution. And so that's one of the reasons. And the other reason is that with every very big political change that happened throughout history, it didn't happen only for one reason, and it didn't only happen because there was a movement that struggled for change, or there was a liberation movement or a popular revolution or whatever. It only happened when a lot of things were aligned to a certain construction that would enable the change. So if we think about the South African struggle that we've talked about before, things had to align together, and there was some kind of political and a global political and economical situation that enabled that change. But also, if we think about the feminist struggle, it was the feminist struggle here in England, the suffragist movement for women's rights for vote. It was a very militant movement, and they only managed to achieve their goals of having the right to vote, not only because of their very militant activism, but also because of the World War, the First World War, and the fact that women got into men's place and took over their role in the economic and in the war effort, and also gave back that place to men when they came back from war. And so as a way of accepting or thanking women for their contribution, they also received those rights. So it's not only the struggle or how militant it is, or how the kind of impression that it makes, but also the economical and the political conditions in which it occurs. So to the next question, can we make a change now? In Israel, no. There is no way of making any change. There is no importance to going out in the streets. I'm sorry to say that, but representation has no significance whatsoever in Israel. It's not like in the US. Like 2 summers ago, I went with JVP to their advocacy an advocacy mission in Washington, and we went and met with Congress people in Washington, asking them to retrieve their help to Israel, to at least ask questions about where does the money that the US is giving Israel is going to, etc. And those kind of things are not possible in Israel, not only because the election system is different than in the US, but also we can see how now all Netanyahu needs, or needed before, and now he's preserving that, is to be able to construct a coalition which is strong enough by aligning with very far-right parties, and that's all. It doesn't matter how many people go out to the streets. It has no effect whatsoever. And so trying to change government policy in that kind of situation is impossible. Where do I think that change can be made? It's also, I want to say that even in the meso levels of policy, like in big institutions such as academia, hospitals, workplaces, industry, etc., they just align with the government position and direction. So the only way, now answering the question that we were given as to how can we make change, so in Israel at least, the only way to make change right now is on the micro level. So in very small structures of NGOs that have some kind of awareness to the situation, in department levels of the university trying to work up. It all depends on the people that you have around you and whether those people are able to listen or want to make some kind of change to their policy, to their inner policy, and then try to work up and change those policies on a larger level, but it will not go much upper. So another way to work out is to recruit or to educate or to reach out to young activists, and there are many young activists now that are going to the streets, so that's an important thing of going to the streets. It's not going to change the government or government policy, but it does create a way of passing the torch of the struggle. And those people, like we were talking about it last week, that all of us anti-Zionist Jews, Israeli Jews at least, we all started as, most of us, started out as Zionists. And we all had to go through a very long journey of unlearning. And this journey is very difficult. I'm not saying that to gain empathy, but what I want to say is that those people, those young people who will go through those processes of unlearning, what it demands is like a shattering and rebuilding of your identity, self-perception, perception of community, etc., etc. And they need a community to hold them while they are going through this difficult situation. And they would probably, most likely, most of them would lose their friends, their family, etc., and all the structures, the social structures that holds them for the moment. So it's very important. This is an activity that I think is super important and is much neglected in Israel. It's creating a community of support for people who could make this journey into anti-Zionism, or at least questioning Israel's policy. One other thing that I think should be done is building alliances, even with political parties and political organizations that are not completely radical, that are even leftist but still Zionists. So in our group, the group that I represent, I'm active in a few groups. So one of them is Israel is Against Apartheid, and another one is Boycott from Within. Both are mainly situated in Israel. And we had a lot of discussions regarding, for example, Umdim Yachad, which is, so to say, an Israeli-Palestinian political group. It also starts to have representations globally. And there is a lot of criticism, a lot of critique about them, because the BNC at least is saying justly that they normalize the conflict, they normalized even the genocide in Gaza in terms of conflict, etc. So they normalized the political situation in Israel, and that they don't speak enough about apartheid and occupation and anti-Zionism. But I think that within Israel, even groups like that should be reached out to and not alienated, because they will have to be radicalized in the future. In the future, there will be no other way than to be detached from Zionism. I don't think there is a future to Zionism, and so I think, voluntarily or not, those groups would have to radicalize, and they should already be educated into that, and and they should have allies that would accompany them in the future. So what my stance is that as Israeli Jewish radical left person, we are a very small group, marginalized group, and we would always be. And there are parties that gain more attraction and gain more people, but we have to stay in contact with them, because one day they will have our position, they will have to adopt it, and we must be there to guide them. So that was about Israel. On the international level, I think there are many things that we could learn from the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And I rely on a book written by Hakan Thorne that said that one of the ways that the struggle became a transnational movement or transnational struggle is by recruiting the media, as we've talked before, or conquering the media in some way, creating a culture of struggle, like songs, symbols, and so on, that would, will take the struggle into different audiences. So the film that ICAHD made is also one way of doing that, is by creating a community and engaging with dissidents in exile. So that could be Palestinian diaspora, but also critical Jews abroad in many countries, and making pressure on the global and international community. Although I share the assertion that international institutions need to be decolonized in themselves, and that they are very biased and do not do enough. I do think that we still have to appeal to them and to governments in different places where we are. So as Israelis Against Apartheid, we are part of a network of organizations, anti-Zionist organizations around the world, from New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, the States, many countries in Europe and in the UK. And we, for example, in Israelis Against Apartheid, wrote a few years ago already letters to diplomats in Israel, asking them to ask their countries to retrieve the diplomatic corps from Israel. And now we initiated a letter from each organization to the foreign minister in that country to ask for the same. And our objective is not only to appeal for that to happen, but also to make seen and to make visible the fact that there is in fact a global movement of anti-Zionist Jews who don't see Israel as our representative, and that Israel policy doesn't in any way, okay, I'll be quick, represent us. So, but On top of all that, I think that we should also push into alliances with Palestinian initiatives, such as adhering to the BDS guidelines, but also initiatives like the One Democratic State in all of its forms, because there are many such initiatives. I'm part of a group that tries to push for Bring Gaza Home. It's called Bring Gaza Home. It's a solution that asks for Israel and international community to bring Palestinians from Gaza to 48 territories and have them stay there until, if some of them want to go back to Gaza, rebuild Gaza. It's a program that is probably not going to happen, and there will not be any international force, or maybe very little support from international forces. But it's very important for us to show that Palestinians should be the one to find a solution for the day after. It's not for international community or Israel to be part of finding the solution. It's the Palestinians that should be the ones to say what they want to happen on the day after. But I also think that one of the important things that we should do is imagine together, Daoud, imagine the future together, because state violence, like genocide, like apartheid, like massacres, like creating war in the Middle East, assassinating political leaders and religious leaders in other countries, etc. All those actions are made in order to eradicate hope. And Smotrich was very clear about it. It's one of their objectives. It's to eradicate Palestinian hope so that they will have no hope for any future. And imagining together in a time of genocide is the most important thing that we can do, because that's one of the purposes of the genocide. It's to eradicate hope so that people will not see any future possible for them. And by thinking, like we were talking in the recess about the fact that, about anti-Semitism and so on, and when I look at you, Daoud, I think we have more in common than most of the people here. And I think that I don't mind if Zionism thinks about going 2,000 years back. I don't mind going 2,000 years back and adopting an Arab identity and being part of the Middle East as an Arab Jew. I don't think Judaism is all about sovereignty. And I think that there is a lot to be shared, and I hope to share a future with other people in the Middle East.
Very moving. Thank you for that. We'll say a little bit more on that later as we wrap up. Just these powerful statements coming out today from people who are very much at the core of this whole subject. Well, now we are absolutely thrilled to have Misha Vides with us today. Misha is a student studying at the University of Edinburgh, another anthropologist. That's 3 of them here today who've taken the platform. And we wanted to give some focus to what's happening with student encampment, student mobilization. We've got to hear from your generation. So we'll turn over to you next, and then we'll have a short Q&A. You have 20 minutes.
First, hi. I'm going to be looking at my computer a lot because I've written down a lot of incoherent things to say. But, so yeah, I'm Misha. I'm studying at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also, as Liv said, Jewish and anti-Zionist. And yeah, I've been involved in like a large variety of different student and non-student groups and actions over the last year. But I'll be focusing today on what I've been doing within the university. So yeah, there are two groups I think first to highlight that I'm in. The first is JPS, which is the Justice for Palestine Society at our university. It's a Palestinian-led student group, which is, the main goal of the group. It's the main body on our campus, which is pushing for divestment of the Edinburgh Uni institution from companies complicit in Israeli apartheid and genocide. The group was not founded last October. It's been active for many years on our campus, obviously because Israeli apartheid and genocide has been going on since 1948. Other goals of the group, which I think are also important to highlight. So it's divestment, it's academic boycott, it's the reduction of policing on campus, it's open denouncement of the university's colonial ties, which I'll get into in a bit. It's combating anti-Semitism through the removal of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which for those who don't know, it's basically a definition of anti-Semitism that equates anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. 7 out of the 11 examples of anti-Semitism are based on criticism of Israel being anti-Semitic, which is incredibly problematic. It's financial reparations and it's scholarships grants to Gazan students, which has been done at our university with Ukrainian students. And it's hosting those students who have served in the IOF. JPS, there's so much to get into about that, which I'll try and do in the 20 minutes, but I think a big thing to push as well, which has been done with most student pro-Palestine groups around globally in the last year, is it's getting more cracked down on by the university, by Scottish police, and it's getting more censored as well. And the other student group I'm in is Kahila, and Kahila means community in Hebrew, and it's a Jewish student group on campus, which myself and 3 other members, thank you so much, founded last October. And so our tagline is a community of Jewish students unequivocally in support of Palestinian liberation and committed to highlighting the diversity of Jewish voices on campus. So for a little bit, I can speak more candidly about this because JPS is it's more cracked down on, but so last October I was going to Palestine protests and I remember seeing someone in a general community protest with a kippah, which is the Jewish hat. And I went up to them and I was like, I'm Jewish too, because I try and visualize myself as being Jewish at protests. And then through that started a general community group chat called Scottish Jews Standing in Solidarity with Palestine. And that's a different thing. But from that, I felt the need to have an explicitly student Jewish anti-Zionist group, because the only group on our campus and on many campuses is the JSOC, which is the Jewish Society. And most of them term themselves to be apolitical, but unfortunately, mainstream Western Judaism is incredibly political. Zionism is institutionalized and indoctrinated into most Jewish institutions. These the need for these kahilas, which have actually been the banner we've all fallen under in the UK, to pop up is because there has been no, as then that also touched upon community space for Jews who aren't Zionists. Most of us in the group call ourselves anti-Zionists, but we intentionally use the slogan Judaism beyond Zionism, because also, as Nat touched upon, Zionism is so institutionalized in Judaism that anti-Zionist is it shouldn't be, but it's seen as this radical step. It's seen as very outside what you've grown up in. So we tried to be a bit more. We thought beyond Zionism was more palatable for people seeking a different community. And then, I kind of touched on this, but Kahila started because I was at a student Palestine protest. I went up to someone who I thought was wearing a kippah, they weren't, and then someone overheard me and introduced me to a dear friend of mine, and we started off Kahila, which has now grown into a formalized university society, which is also important because JPS is not a university society, because the university would then have the names of the members. That would lead to greater censorship and disciplinary action. But Kahila, we really wanted to be a university society to legitimize our voice as anti-Zionist Jews to the university, because the concepts of Jewish fear and Jewish safety are incredibly weaponized and instrumentalized by these institutions. So to have a legitimate Jewish body on campus saying no was a big part of our goal as well. Sorry, I'm speaking quite quickly, I just wrote loads of stuff down. Another main thing is we want to show that Jews are not a monolith, not only in terms of Zionism, anti-Zionism, but also Judaism in the West very much centres Ashkenazi Jews, which are Jews of Central and Eastern European heritage. So another goal of our group is also to de-center Ashkenazi Jews. That also comes into like white supremacist like ideology within 48. So the goals of Kahila, which I think are important to say, are Jewish space outside of Zionism, Judaism that does not center Ashkenazi Judaism, uplifting the voices of Palestinians and Arabs, education, and fighting anti-Semitism on campus through also a removal of the ICAHD definition of anti-Semitism, because unfortunately, a couple years ago in our university, there was big, like most Western universities have adopted the ICAHD definition of anti-Semitism, and unfortunately Jewish voices are usually the only ones included in these conversations, even though Palestinian voices for sure should be included, because this is not about, like, ICAHD is not about anti-Semitism, it's about Israel. But yeah, so there's a big movement in general with like anti-Zionist Jews to remove the ICAHD definition. It's been seen in actually Napier University, Aberdeen, Toronto University is like a really great shining example of redefining anti-Semitism in an institution. But yeah, that's a bit about student stuff. And then to give context to Edinburgh University, it invests a total of £70,367,464 in bodies complicit in the active occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And out of that, over 20 million is in direct holdings, so that's like arms investments, and our university actually has like very strong links with like apartheid technologies, so companies that are like the surveillance technologies in checkpoints in the occupied West Bank. And then there's like 50 million plus in indirect holdings, such as like Amazon, Alphabet, all of these. And like actually those investments increased by over £10 million since last October. So not only is the university aware that it's profiting, not only is the university profiting off genocide, it's aware of the fact that genocide is profitable and has decided to increase that. They've also been incredibly strategic about when they're releasing these financial documents and who has access to them. So they strategically released the finances when the academic year had ended and student mobilization wasn't as easy. Also, important context is, as people have touched upon, the difference of Ukrainians and Palestinians right now, that when Russia began its invasion of Ukraine, our university withdrew immediately from any of its stocks in Russian bodies. They've told us, that's because there was a legal requirement in the UK, but with the ICJ ruling that this is a genocide, it's also a legal requirement. The university is also currently breaching the Human Rights Act of 1998, I think it is, and also a charities trustee law in Scotland from 2005. So the university is breaking the law, as many of these universities are. Another context of Edinburgh is Arthur Balfour. The writer of the Balfour Declaration was the Chancellor of Edinburgh University in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was written. His portrait still hangs in Old College in the university, which is where our encampment was. So there's an incredibly strong financial and historical complicity in the occupation of Palestine by Edinburgh University. They've also offered absolutely nothing, no forms of care or support to Palestinian students right now, but they have done with Israeli students. And also Palestinian Arab Muslim students are not invited to meetings that me as a Jewish student have been invited to. For example, I've had meetings with the police on Jewish safety. There's been no meeting about Muslim or Arab safety. Me and Livnat have also been invited to meetings for Jewish staff and student safety on campus. There has been no equivalent for Muslim or Arab students. I think that's important to highlight. And then what's been going on in Edinburgh over the last year is incredibly difficult to be succinct about, but basically there have been two major channels of student mobilization. I would say one is the bureaucratic channel, passing motions through student elected representatives. We passed 97% of the student body voted for divestment, but this has not been upheld whatsoever. There's been meetings with senior management, open letters, signatures, petitions, All of them have really come to no avail with the university. I would say they've all led to, at best, like the university potentially responding to it with like very muted words, but mostly been completely ignored. And then there's been non-bureaucratic channels of student mobilization. So last October 11th, 2023 was like the first student protest for Palestine, and since then there have been like weekly student protests on our campus. There have also been sit-ins. Our first sit-in was at the library, November 17th last year, to which the university responded to a student-wide email calling us threatening and scary. Obviously, anyone who reads the email, which I will happily share after, very much shows this idea, once again, of Jewish safety and fear being incredibly instrumentalized. Like, they don't say Jewish specifically, but anyone can read between the lines and see who they're talking about, of who's feeling threatened. That's also completely ignoring. There was a Jewish bloc. Myself and another person spoke at this protest. Like, I think, another thing important to mention is like anti-Zionist Jews. Not only are we involved in being called threatening and scary, but also our Jewish presence is being completely ignored in these protests. There's lecture disruptions. There's occupations. 2 buildings have been occupied on our university campus or reclaimed. There's been hard pickets. There was a hard picket, which means workers get sent home with pay for the day, but the building is not in use, so it stops a day's work. The finance building was hard picketed last Friday. And then there was an encampment in Old College, which lasted over a month in May. I was in that. There was also hunger strikes, which we did. I did a hunger strike as well, and there was about 25 plus students doing a hunger strike for over 33 days. This was all following the lead of the general public of Edinburgh, actually, which I'm sure many of you saw the encampment outside Parliament. And hunger strike is also outside Parliament, so we tried to, I think, personally, a critique I have of Edinburgh University activism is a lack of connection with the general community in Edinburgh. I think any elitist institution like Edinburgh University has that as a problem, but yeah, I think I think some of us are trying to push for that more, and I think the encampment brotherhood was a good example of that. But yeah, even with hunger strikes, which is obviously an extreme form of protest, the university responded at best asking for the well-being of the hunger strikers, and in general responded with absolutely nothing. People were hospitalised for this hunger strike. The university really completely ignored us. There were graduation disruptions. There were 3 major walkouts of graduates, all holding different forms of solidarity statements or Palestinian flags. And then there's been career fair disruptions, which, as I said, arms companies, technology companies that are all complicit in Israeli genocide are being promoted, not just invested in, but also heavily promoted by the university. Yeah, so as I've said, the university ignores us or will condemn it and call it threatening. Another major strategic point of the uni is this, there have been court meetings by the university, but there was one in June that was supposed to vote on divestment. It was delayed till October 7th, which I think is incredibly obviously, I don't know why the university would put it on October 7th, but and then they've delayed it again until March, so they're actually just ignoring us, condemning us, or just delaying decisions. And they currently say there is a race review going on in the university. Palestine actually was not included. Now I think it might be included, but the work of this is actually all being done by Palestinian students who have graduated the university. So, and yeah, I think there's a wider role of, obviously the student movement can be seen globally in many different ways, and there's a long history of student mobilization for different justice campaigns, but in Edinburgh specifically, occupation of university buildings is an age-old tradition. So encampments, in 1974, there was an encampment in Old College, in Edinburgh University, for divestment of the university from South African apartheid. Actually, someone from that encampment visited us in one of our occupied buildings this year, which was super cool. And yeah, I think that's a super condensed version. And I don't think I've even remotely touched on everything, but I think the main thing to say is I've learned much more from all of this than I generally ever have in university. I'm currently actually on an interruption from university for the year, so we'll see how that goes. And yeah, I'm like not remotely an expert. Like there are millions of students, and also we're not only millions of students doing this, but we are being led by like Palestinian students like in the diaspora leading these structures, and also Palestinian students like on the ground in Palestine who are like showing the way, like with hunger strikes specifically. Like hunger strikes are a massive tradition of Palestinian political prisoners. Like we are only taking an example from them. And yeah, thank you very much. Like that's super broad, but
Well done, Misha. Courageous, active, determined are all things, really important to hear from you, and we're glad to have been able to include your voice today. Okay, 10 minutes for questions, yes. 1, 2, okay, we'll start at 3. Yes.
Just how do you keep the continuity going from year to year in the universities? How do you make sure that the freshmen coming up will continue what you're doing? Do you educate them? Do you go back? How do you do that? And what happens in the holidays?
Okay, so we'll have continuity between students. I'm going to take the 3 questions
I was
now.
going to say, how much has this been reported by the media? All these disruptions, all the student actions?
Okay, students, and what about you? For LiveNet as well as for Misha.
I used to work at the University of Edinburgh, and I recall an earlier occupation of the main lecture theatre, after which the secretary of the university conceded and agreed to provide a scholarship for a Palestinian student from the Birdside University in Pallister, in the occupied Palestinian territories. I've often wondered if that has continued, and so I just wonder about if that's. I see there is an article in North Edinburgh News. I just was looking about that occupation, which was of the Gordon Aikman Lecture Theatre, as it's called now.
was it was it the one like this year?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so those 3 questions all to you, and then we'll see if we've got a round for you, LiveNet. Okay. Yes, please.
Okay, well, the first one with the continuity. Well, I think first thing to say is we are like we're all incredibly burnt out. Like part of the reason, like which I think is important to say, like we don't know yet. Like obviously once again none of this started on October 7th, but I think this type of like mass, like very urgent action, like we're all, as students who have been involved in it, like are still figuring out how to have continuity with it. But I think also there's a like wisdom being passed down through student activists is like a really beautiful thing. Like when I did the occupations this year, like these were my first occupations of university buildings and at the time I was in my 2nd year of university. But we had like 4th years who had done like 5 different occupations. So I think it's like this wisdom is being passed down, and you are being shown the ropes. Like ultimately, like we are like groups working towards a goal, but they are also community groups. Like we're sharing meals, we're sharing, like we're hanging out, we're sharing this like information. Also, when you're living in like encampments or occupation under like different forms of security or surveillance, you become very acquainted with people. And also, yeah, so I think it's wisdom being passed down through groups. It's people also just helping each other out. But yeah, there's definitely a problem of burnout. And yeah, I think that's something we're figuring out. But I think it's also knowing that there wasn't another option, if that makes sense. Like to not act, I think in the last year it wasn't an option for many of us. There's actually, if you don't mind, I might read a little quote. Just the group I'm in, the JPS group, we're actually releasing a zine next week at Edinburgh Zine Fair, and there's a really beautiful quote in it, which I probably won't be able to. Oh, I found it. That it might resonate with some people, maybe not, but it's from an extract from Conversation, a poem by Lisa Seher Majaj. Did your protestations do any good? No, I lost my breath, I lost my words, I lost my heart, but had I not argued, I would have lost my soul. I think that resonated in different ways with a fair number of people in the group. Yeah, so still figuring out continuity, but figuring it out for sure because it's not an option to not continue. In terms of media, actually, English universities got a lot more media coverage than Scottish universities, but the majority of media coverage we had was during the encampment, and it was mostly from different Arab news outlets. So Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, they all came to the encampment. Otherwise that, maybe it's been drips and drabs from different Edinburgh news outlets, but I wouldn't say anything major outside of major Arab news outlets. And to be fair, when we were doing, the hunger strike was probably what also caused the most amount of media attention, but it was excuse my crass language, but absolute bullshit. It was we got calls from the BBC, the Financial Times, but all of the questions they were asking us had absolutely nothing to do with Palestine, and all the questions were asked were about anti-Semitism, and yeah, which was incredibly disappointing and completely missed the mark of what you're doing. Yeah, and I think as we spoke about the media before, media definitely needs to step up and do better. And then scholarships. I honestly haven't heard of any other scholarships being granted.
But there are lots of scholarships for Ukrainian.
Yeah, I haven't heard of. I don't think there's any program being done for Gaza.
It's a possible idea to raise.
Yeah, it's one of the goals of the JPS campaign is to get scholarships for students from Gaza, but I haven't heard of any program being initiated in the uni. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, question back there. And then Jeff.
I had a question for Rivka.
Yeah.
I was very interested. I mean, it sounds almost like a coming out process of becoming anti-Zionist and moving from a Zionist Jew to an anti-Zionist Jew. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and I realise that could be taken as a very personal question. But what sort of brought you to that point where you just had to break with Zionism?
So that question, and Jeff, you have a question for me?
I'd just like to ask Misha, what Palestinians or Palestinian groups in Palestine are you guys coordinating with?
Okay, good. Livnat.
Yep. So yes, it's very much coming out situation, and in fact, so my PhD research was about Israeli Jews who were against apartheid, against Israeli regime, and part of radical left activism, and left Israel for political reasons, either moved abroad or to Palestinian localities in the West Bank. And some of them are also queer, and some of them said that, those who were queer said that it was harder to come out as anti-Zionist than to come out as a queer to their family. That it was a harder situation because you have to break up with much more institutionalized identities that you have to adhere to than when coming out as a queer person. So it's very much like that. What led me, I think a gradual, so I became anti-Zionist very late. In my late 40s, so it took me a while to break out of Zionism, and it's a process that I'm still going through. So a few years ago, Linda interviewed me for an ICAHD newsletter, and I said that she asked me if I determine myself as an what made me become an anti-Zionist, and I said that I'm not an anti-Zionist. I said I would like to find a way to describe myself in a positive way and not in a negative way. But now, with everything that is happening, I'm definitely anti. I do have a positive image of the future that I would like to see, like what I would like to see happen, and not what is happening now, but I'm definitely anti-Zionist, and what Zionism is bringing forth not only for Palestinians but also for Jews. So in some of the groups that I'm part of, or the networks that I'm part of, people call themselves like it's a global Jews for Palestine, or European Jews for Palestine, and I think we are just as much for us as for Palestine, because Zionism is an anti-Semitic movement. It has anti-Semitic imageries of what a Jew is, and I think what is happening now in Palestine is heart-shattering because of the way, on top of the horrors that we are making, it also deprives us of our humanity, and it resonates with something that people said here about the trauma that soldiers are going through, and I think it will take decades before people will be able to talk about the trauma of what they have done, and instead of what they've seen or witnessed. But it's there. So we are destroying ourselves in the course of eradicating other people.
Great. And then lastly,
yeah, I'm definitely not the expert. I'm not the expert person in our group, because there's a lot of we have different working groups for outreach and stuff like that. But I know we've got connections with Mobilized University, with the student group there, and I think there is another connection with Palestinian University, but I don't want to give a name that's wrong. But also I think it's mostly through different interpersonal links that different people have, if that makes sense. With friends or family who are in Palestine, or myself, 2023 summer, I was part of a Palestinian-led but Jewish Palestinian co-resistance group thing in Mustafiyata, mostly in Umacha and Tawani. So I myself have links with different families there, but everyone's kind of got their own thing, but we are connected with some groups. That's vague, but yeah, I'm definitely not the expert person, but I know quite a handful of Palestinian student groups on the ground we are having connections with.
excellent, excellent. Well, I want to thank each of you for what you shared, and most of all for the journeys you've been on, and for the way that you have chosen a different path for your lives, your activism, your vision for the future. Thank you very much.